Tonight, our guest speaker is Tracey Campbell, who's an associate professor at the University of Kentucky. And those of you that get the Kentucky Humanities magazine will see that he had an article. This is the, well, it doesn't have a date, but it was this year. Had an article about Ed Pritchard, and Tracey's written a book about Ed Pritchard. But he's here tonight to talk to us about Kentucky's tobacco wars, which were described in Carl Kramer's Capital on the Kentucky as being a full-scale guerrilla action where hooded night riders burned houses and barns, destroyed tobacco beds, flogged and even murdered tobacco farmers. So I'll turn it over now to Tracey Campbell.
Thank you. Thank you, John. I did write a book on Ed Pritchard, and as a lot of people ask me, what are you going to do for a second book? What they don't know is that is the second book. I did a book about 10 years ago on the tobacco wars. That really turned me on to history in the first place. So I'm delighted to be back here tonight talking about it. John and I had hoped that I could come here in July, but considering my wife is due with our second child on July 25th, that we didn't think scheduling that would be an appropriate venture at this point. So thank you for having me here in June. You know, it's hard to open up a newspaper and not see a number of stories that invariably refer to tobacco and its declining position here in Kentucky. Not only is the price falling, but there seems to be a crisis looming that might spell the end of tobacco cultivation in our state as we know it. The tobacco industry is coming under increased fire from the federal government. There seems to be a growing cultural war against the ill effects of smoking, in which a number of states want to ban smoking. And there is a conflict growing as well between growers and large manufacturers. And at bottom is this disparity between the poverty and the powerlessness of tobacco producers on one hand, and the wealth and the arrogance of tobacco manufacturers on the other. Now, of course, the newspapers I'm referring to are not modern ones, but ones dated about almost 100 years ago. Here in our own state, these dynamics played themselves out in a series of organizational drives among Kentucky tobacco growers that had all the elements of latter-day labor struggles. Some of these attempts at organizing were vividly successful, while others eventually disintegrated into violent confrontations between growers and big tobacco and angry exchanges between the growers themselves. These battles, though mostly forgotten, comprise, I think, an epic story not only in Kentucky history but in American history that may help us view some modern-day newspapers with a little more clarity that seem to have some of those same dynamics playing out as well. First, some background. The modern tobacco industry was created out of a monopoly that once controlled the world's tobacco markets called the American Tobacco Company that was headed by James B. Duke. Beginning in the late 1890s, Duke successfully bought out over 250 tobacco manufactories around the country. And by the dawn of the 1900s, he effectively controlled the world's tobacco manufacturing centers. And most ominously for Kentucky tobacco growers, he became really the one buyer for their crop. In 1905, for example, the ATC, the American Tobacco Company, produced 80% of the country's plug and twist tobacco, 71% of U.S. smoking tobacco, 96% of the country's popular snuff. By that time, one noted authority on American business has claimed that Duke and the ATC was better suited to control the tobacco industry than Standard Oil was to control oil. With that kind of market power, Duke's company could effectively dictate the price of tobacco, which by the early 1900s had fallen well below the cost of production. Meanwhile, the American Tobacco Company raked in record profits in the early 1900s, so much so, in fact, that the Bureau of Corporations began an antitrust investigation that eventually led to the nominal breakup of this monopoly by 1911. So in many ways, the tobacco industry then was perceived as greedy and as arrogant as the modern-day industry, if not even more. Now, in Kentucky, there were essentially two major areas of tobacco cultivation. One was centered in the western area of the state, which produced a darker, stronger variety. It was used primarily in snuff and chewing tobaccos. In central Kentucky, a lighter, milder type was grown in the Burley area that was used primarily in the production of cigarettes. Both areas, while not in direct competition with each other, underwent the same market forces and were facing the same kind of desperate conditions by the early 1900s. Now, another aspect of this debate, which is little known but is starting to receive some historical attention lately, is the drive among some of the same forces which led the Prohibition campaign against alcohol to try at least do the same for tobacco. It was called the Anti-Cigarette League of America. It was led by Lucy Page Gaston and David Starr Jordan, the president of Stanford University. While we may not have heard much of them, they were successful in getting 15 states to prohibit the sale and advertisement of tobacco completely from 1895 to 1910. 15 states. 21 other states, including Kentucky, considered such bills but did not pass them. The cultural war against smoking in the early 1900s was on the march. Now, reformers like Jordan and Lucy Page Gaston in, say, 1905 saw cigarettes not only as a public health issue, but saw them contributing to the declining morals of young men, mostly men, as well as innocent young women throughout America. This little-known reform effort, however, shared the same kind of zeal and emanating spirit as that of the contemporary anti-smoking groups who hoped for a smoke-free America. So for those who grew tobacco on their small farms in Kentucky 100 years ago, the writing was on the wall, it seems, that tobacco was on its way out, or at least was in for the fight of its life. But the farmers didn't quit in Kentucky. In a very real way, they couldn't quit. It might be helpful here just to take a try and understand the mechanics of why they grew tobacco. The credit mechanisms, which emerged out of Reconstruction throughout the South, demanded that cash crops be cultivated. In many parts of the South, the operating injunction from Reconstruction on was no cotton, no credit. In Kentucky, it was no tobacco, no credit. Southern country stores, like one I found in Muhlenberg County, the Martin and Johnson Country Store, would not extend credit unless tobacco was grown by farmers like J.T. and Kate Strand. In turn, these farmers grew as much of the crop as they could in order to get out of debt. But consequently, each year saw rising levels of production that, of course, brought down the price. J.T. Strand, an illiterate tobacco farmer, commented on the dual nature of the local tobacco economy in Muhlenberg County. He said, quote, "The harder we worked, the less we had," end of quote. If you couple that with the monopoly power of one of the biggest industries in the country, as well as the brewing cultural war against tobacco, it can be seen, I think, that Kentucky's tobacco growers were up against the world in ways I think modern growers can relate to. Now, Kentucky's tobacco farmers in the early 1900s did not wait passively for the next shoe to drop. They organized. And it started in the western area of the state, an area known as the Black Patch. And by the early 1900s, the local tobacco economy was in crisis. Prices for dark tobacco had dropped to 4 cents per pound, lower than the cost of producing it. The Dark Patch area had been the one area in Kentucky where the Farmers Alliance, a decade before, had spread the populist message. And as I demonstrated, I hope, in the Politics of Despair, this experiential education in agrarian and insurgency informed these cooperative movements of the early 1900s. In other words, the tobacco farmers, the farmer revolt in western Kentucky didn't drop out of the sky one day because prices had gotten so bad. Rather, it built upon lessons learned in cooperative marketing experiments and political organizing of a previous decade. Now, the growers down there were led by a wealthy landowner named Felix Ewing, who organized something called the Planters Protective Association, the PPA. It was designed as a cooperative marketing co-op, which would collectively pool the region's dark tobacco and sell it to the Tobacco Trust in bulk. The trouble with the pool, however, started immediately. Little, if any, resources existed for struggling farmers as they awaited the sale of their crop. The desire to sell independently of the pool was also necessarily strong. So what democratic organizing could not achieve, violence and intimidation did. Ewing, for example, advised PPA members to initiate a campaign of open ostracism against anyone who refused to join. In church, he said, quote, "Sidetrack him. Do not know him when you see him," the ones who wouldn't join the pool. Ewing's campaign extended to his next-door neighbor, who was debt-ridden and decided to sell his leaf outside of the association. Ewing proclaimed that no one within the PPA dare speak with the neighbor or even help him with his farm. The neighbor got the message and soon sold his farm and left Western Kentucky for good. A specter of armed, hooded men on horseback soon terrorized the region, otherwise known as night riding. Such outbreaks of violence could be simply having a non-cooperator's plant bed scraped, or having non-pool tobacco barns burned at night. Threatening notes might be left on one's door. Eventually, those who refused to join the PPA, who were derisively called hillbillies, were threatened, beaten, and sometimes killed. A leading tobacco journal in the area conveyed the opprobrium that the term held. Quote, "Call me Benedict Arnold, call me Judas Iscariot, but don't ever call me a hillbilly." This economic and cultural war affected every aspect of life in the Black Patch and became the subject, I should say incidentally, of a novel of a man born in Guthrie, Kentucky, Robert Penn Warren, his first major novel called Night Rider, which is a brilliant little book. The Silent Brigade, as they were known, extended their fight to the tobacco manufacturers, and one of the most daring raids occurred on December 7th, 1907, in Hopkinsville. There, a band of night riders, numbering between 300 and 500, descended upon the town and burned warehouses and shot indiscriminately into homes. One resident was killed, several beaten, and over $200,000 worth of property destroyed in one evening. The leader of the Night Riders, Dr. David Amos, had proclaimed that farmers were like dogs, and, quote, "the only way to handle them is to drive them like dogs," end of quote. Against this backdrop, newly elected Governor Augustus Wilson deployed state militia to the Black Patch in a futile effort to try and quell the violence. Wilson even wrote to President Theodore Roosevelt to seek the possible use of federal troops in Kentucky if conditions worsened. Now, the PPA, the Planters Protective Association, meanwhile, managed to sign up even greater amounts of tobacco each year. While the 1904 crop had brought just a little over a nickel per pound, the pooled crops of 1907 managed to bring in about a dime per pound. While statistically this may be perceived as a victory, I think the prices that they were able to win need to be understood in a broader context. These prices were obtained after months of waiting, and various PPA storage and administrative fees were deducted. By 1908, the PPA was limping into another year in full knowledge that without the assistance of the Night Riders, their membership would flounder, and the long-term prospects began to look rather bleak. Well, one of the interesting things about doing historical research is that sometimes you ask a question and you get some answers that you're not expecting. While I was doing all this work in Western Kentucky, I kept seeing references to some remarkable things happening here in Central Kentucky. And although the Central Kentucky region is not usually associated with the tobacco wars, here a different scenario played itself out in ways that I think far eclipsed the better-known Black Patch War. In fact, in 1908, farmers here did something I think unprecedented in American agricultural history. Here, an organization in the early 1900s formed called the Burley Tobacco Society. And like their counterparts in western Kentucky, the organizers in the Burley area sought to form a co-op in which growers pooled their crops, hoping that in withholding massive amounts of tobacco from the market might increase the demand and consequently the price that the trust might be willing to pay. By 1907, the BTS had pooled nearly 65% of the Kentucky's Burley crop. And coupled with the 1905 and 1906 crops, millions and millions of pounds were being held in BTS warehouses throughout central Kentucky. By early 1908, BTS organizers led by J. Campbell Cantrell of Georgetown and Clarence Levis devised a daring and rather outrageous plan to convince area growers not to plant any tobacco whatsoever in 1908, thus making their stored tobacco even more valuable as a negotiating tool with Duke and the ATC. In effect, they wanted to go on strike. Now, the prospects of successfully pulling this off are obviously remote. The sheer task of organizing growers in nearly 40 counties to not even grow a crop had been in the minds of cotton and tobacco growers for years, but never had such an approach come even remotely close to working. Now, the vice president of the ATC came to central Kentucky in early 1908 to view the BTS's pooled crop and actually offered the rather sizable price of 15 cents per pound. But as a sign of the growing confidence of the tobacco co-op, the BTS refused and proceeded on with the strike. In March, out of approximately 100,000 acres in the region that had once been devoted to tobacco, only 16,000 acres were planted in 1908. This is quite an achievement. But still having 16% of the crop being grown is no strike. For those who grew a crop, of course, they could expect higher than ever prices going to market, in effect taking advantage of the strikers' plight. This tension cut across county lines and divided neighbors throughout the Burley region. And by mid-spring of 1908, the same vigilante methods employed in the Black Patch appeared in the Burley area, night riders. One notice in a local newspaper read this, quote, "O fool, raise no tobacco. Dare to raise a stalk of tobacco on your land or assist anyone else in the raising, and ye shall pay the penalty with your home and life. So be ye warned." Signed, Night Riders. The threats extended well beyond newspaper ads. On March 10th, a group of 50 riders destroyed 15,000 pounds of non-pooled tobacco at a warehouse in Brooksville. 3 nights later, a band of about 60 riders destroyed barns of non-poolers in Scott and Woodford counties. The local press agent denounced the violence, which in turn produced a reply from a woman named Alice Lloyd, not the same one who started the college in Eastern Kentucky, but she worked with the BTS. And she said, quote, "Burn a tobacco barn or whip a trust agent, and the press and the pulpit are in a frenzy of indignation. On the other hand, systematically, in the name of business, take away from the laborer the products of his toil, stifle his ambition, quench his aspirations, destroy his hope, and the press and the pulpit have little to say." The Central Kentucky War soon became deadly. A Nicholas County farmer named Hiram Hedges was visited by night riders on the night of March 21st. Hedges had long defied the BTS, and he had set out a crop. He was called from his home and gunned down in front of his family. In the spring and early summer of 1908, I counted 43 separate known instances of night rider activity throughout the bluegrass. And incidentally, there were several here in Franklin County. On February 27th, the Head and Switzer warehouse was burned here in Franklin County. And various farmers, some like Henry Forsee or the individuals we were talking about mentioned in the book on the Campbell in Kentucky, were beaten and murdered. So soon, many frightened and thoroughly intimidated growers decided to scrape up their crops in order to avoid visits from the night riders. Although the BTS officially denounced the violence, there was no doubt that the tobacco co-op benefited from these vigilante methods. The strike's effectiveness was dramatically announced that summer by the state agricultural commissioner, who announced that 96% of the previous year's crop had been eliminated. The drastic depletion of an entire year's worth of valued burley took the ATC by surprise. And in November of 1908, the ATC relented in ways that would humble even the most dedicated labor organizer. After threatening to dump their entire holdings onto small independent producers, the American Tobacco Company caved in to all of the co-op's demands. They gave them 20 cents per pound for the 1906 crop and 17 cents per pound for the 1907 crop, a deal that totaled over $12.5 million for the BTS. Evidence of the leverage that the co-op commanded was on display the next morning when the BTS demanded a further concession, a small $3 per hogshead fee, which totaled about $250,000. When the Tobacco Trust balked, the BTS threatened to cancel the deal entirely, so the anxious trust relented yet again and agreed once again to all of the BTS's demands. For struggling tobacco farmers here in central Kentucky, the announcement of the settlement of this strike met with unbridled celebration. The Cincinnati Enquirer proclaimed, quote, "No class of men in any state have suffered more hardships or been more debt-ridden." The strike was an unparalleled success, and national commentators, even with the New York Times, who came to the Louisville hotel where the deal was reached, made grand pronouncements about not only the future of the tobacco co-op here in central Kentucky, but the bright future that agricultural workers throughout the country faced using this example. But the tactic of a strike, of course, an agricultural strike, could not address any kind of the long-term challenges facing Kentucky's tobacco growers. It could not, for example, address the problem of agricultural credit that forced tobacco growers in Kentucky and cotton growers in the Deep South into a state of virtual peonage. Nor could it significantly alter the power of the American Tobacco Company. After selling their crops at the prices they wanted, the simple fact of the matter was, as it stood in the winter of 1909, was that farmers in the Burley region were in the same kind of debilitating economic conditions they had found themselves in 5 years earlier. Nothing essentially had changed. As the 1909 growing season loomed, tobacco farmers throughout Kentucky still relied on tobacco to obtain credit, and they still had one buyer for their product. For the BTS, it soon died because of deep anger among its members as to how some of its hard-won money had been spent. Internal records of the co-op, kept at the University of Kentucky, revealed that Clarence Lebus, one of the chairmen of the BTS, took over $24,000 in salary for 1907 and 1908. He'd given himself a raise for 1909 of almost $25,000. A munificent amount for a salary in 1908. Further records show that the co-op spent over $550,000 on selected expenses, such as office furniture, expenses for various leaders of the co-op, that amounted to, in terms of the 1908 sale, about 2.5 million pounds of tobacco. In addition, growers were shocked in central Kentucky that in new contracts in 1909, they were required to spend 10% of their earnings in buying shares of a new joint stock company that the BTS ran. So what had begun as a democratic organization had lapsed into violence, and then into a top-heavy organization that spent money in a less than frugal manner and made economic pronouncements on hard-pressed farmers without any kind of input from them. By 1909, farmers lost confidence in the BTS, and they began planting as much tobacco as they possibly could. The following year, so little tobacco was pooled in central Kentucky counties that the county organizers abandoned the pool altogether. Similar conditions brought down the PPA in western Kentucky, and by 1910, the tobacco wars were over in Kentucky. The Supreme Court, the very next year, broke up, I should mention, the ATC into component smaller companies by 1911. Now, although some of them may have thought cigarettes were on their way out, by the First World War, the cigarette's hold on American culture had been solidified. Smoking became glamorous, and big tobacco enjoyed mountainous profits throughout the rest of the century. Tobacco's long history in the 20th century, including its inclusions with the AAA of the New Deal, the love affair it's had in Hollywood, and the Surgeon General's 1964 report, as well as the recent agreement between the attorneys general and the big tobacco companies in excess of over $200 billion, I think have all played themselves out against the backdrop of the original tobacco war. So what, if any, lessons do these events here in central Kentucky and western Kentucky almost a century ago provide for a struggling tobacco economy today? Well, let me just offer a couple. One is the power of organizing for collective action. Separate, farmers have no power, but together, despite the task involved in organizing rural areas, farmers of all walks have a collective voice that generates considerable audiences, particularly political audiences. Second is a more difficult one. Despite it all, the farmers in Kentucky in the tobacco wars were eventually crushed in their efforts to bring better prices and living conditions to the black patch and to the burley areas. Because their efforts were not directed toward the long-term reasons, they were trapped in poverty in the first place, such as the debilitating credit mechanisms in place after Reconstruction or the role of monopolistic corporations in keeping prices low. That's not to say that farmers were not aware of their problems. They just could not devise any approach that could see longer than the next growing season, and this hampered them. A strike, as monumental as it was in 1908, simply could not work today because of foreign tobacco fields that can offer cheaper burley to the manufacturers. But another lesson is the vivid ways in which the non-democratic structures of both co-ops destroyed the confidence that regular farmers had for their own organization. And despite the dire predictions of reformers, tobacco use obviously did not end in 1910. To the contrary, it became synonymous with glamour. And throughout most of the remainder of the century, as new markets and new methods unfolded, tobacco was bigger than ever. So it might stand us in good stead to remember the strength of collective action, the importance of maintaining democratic forms within those collective structures, and the challenges of devising long-term strategies for a viable rural economy. Certainty that tobacco is finished, I should paraphrase Mark Twain, are exaggerated. We shall probably see many more events like the tobacco wars again. So with that, if I could, I'll be happy to take any questions or comments. Yes, sir.
My aunt, who was born in 1902, talked about an incident with her father, which would be my grandfather, who had a lumber mill at Broadway and Wilkinson, and that they were threatened, which I assume he was making hogsheads. I don't know. I assume she was 5 or 6 at the time. And so they went after, I guess, people that were a part of the agricultural economy or the tobacco economy, not just those people growing tobacco, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah. I gave a talk like this about a year ago in Bourbon County to a very small group. I mentioned, remember I said something about Hiram Hedges, the man who was killed on his front porch with his babies on the front porch. Well, when it was finished, one woman came up to me and said, well, I was one of those babies. And Hiram Hedges was my father, and she took out a lot of his pictures of him. And she was on the porch when the night riders came and shot him. So it's not hard to find a lot of examples of, like I said, this is kind of invisible, it seems like. That's what struck me when I started this whole thing, was that if you look at this on a national scale, this is a remarkable event. But here in Kentucky, it seems to be almost swept under the carpet. But if you ask enough people, they can remember enough, even through oral history of a century ago, to remember some of those events. Right here.
Tracey, do you have any information on the extent to which Robert Penn Warren altered history in order to make a good novel, or
Right.
Is that, how close is he to events
Well,
as you know?
keep in mind, he was a very small child. And so I imagine he was getting a lot of this from hearsay or from relatives or from the culture. But I think it's a great novel. It's his first real novel, and it's Percy Munn, the main character there, is undergoing all these dynamics that I was mentioning tonight. And you can see how, you know, in the book I had to write, you're not trying to rationalize violence or say that it's a good thing. What you're trying to do is understand it. And I think that's what Robert Penn Warren was trying to do, is try and at least understand. When we think of night riding, we think of Klan activities that are racially motivated. At least in Western Kentucky, it started out being non-racially motivated. Now, there was some what we call white capping, which is if there's, say, there was an African-American community in Golden Pond that one night was visited by night riders, and they were told to leave the area. The reason being, as a white capping episode, is that it would increase maybe the labor opportunities for white farmers there. So it's hard to talk about anything in the early 1900s and not have it divulge into race. But I think it's a great novel. And there's been 2 or 3 novels since then. I saw one not too long ago called, I just saw it in Joseph Bell, I think, Prime Leaf or something like that. It's over in the Kentucky section. That's just maybe a year or 2 old.
Well,
Yeah.
I thought it was born in 1897, and he never talked about it a whole lot, but this made quite an impression, and he was still able to talk about how, you know, he did break up friendships, he broke up, well, it was like any strike.
Yeah.
And when I've been through those, and it does, you know, breaks up families, breaks up friendships. And again, though, we cannot know the feelings, as you say, I'm against violence, I think. But when it's your livelihood, and when you're given $30, $40, even in the 20s, we would get $40 for our crop, and that carried you to next year. Of course, you're charging everything. I mean, it's terrible, but when certain things get down to it, people will do very violent actions.
Well, as I try
Something about it.
As I try and tell my students, imagine working all year and not only making 0, making less than 0, and working sun up to sundown. That's essentially what's happening to Southern agriculturalists throughout the country after Reconstruction. That they're getting more and more in debt the harder and harder they work, which seems to run completely in contrast to the American dream, that you work hard, you save, you build a life. And for agriculturalists, they were finding the exact opposite, and the frustration was palpable. I decided to use the word strike in my book because the farmers used it. But you can see at any time, say, there's a picket line, whether it's Hormel workers or striking pilots, and someone tries to cross it, you see the anger rise. Well, then you can maybe start understanding a little bit more of the tobacco wars. No, nobody wants to justify killing people. I mean, that helped destroy the movement. But what they saw was, well, if we can get 90% of the people to join a crop and not grow a crop for a year, which, like I said, it's the only time I've ever found in American history where a strike actually was pulled off. To see a few people thinking, well, if I produce a crop and can take it to market, I can get 3 or 4 times what I did before. You can see the tension there. Now, I was a student. The reason I started this, I was a graduate student at Duke. So I had James B. Duke's papers in my backyard, so I would start reading them. And of course, that was part of his strategy, was there to go in, start offering all the prices you could to people, and you'll destroy this movement. So,
It's human nature. People
Yeah.
are people. No matter
It's-
what it is.
I mean, this is a bad example. It's like looking at a riot in the city and not saying that you're justifying it, but what is it that's producing this mass anger? It just doesn't fall out of the sky one day. It's produced by something. And I think, as Robert Penn Warren was showing, it's a lot more than just a couple years of bad prices. It's decades and decades building up to a moment. And, you know, history books like to end on a note of progress. That, well, even though it was bad, things got better at the end. And I couldn't end this book on a note of progress. I think it was ominous as to what was going to happen for the rest of the century. Yes, sir.
About a year or so ago, I read a book on economic development in the South about the railroads, the Illinois Central, Seaport, and everything. Well, they were trying to introduce new agricultural methods and that within the South for better cash crops. Did you come across that?
Oh, yes. You can look in any of the agricultural books, whether they're coming out of the government or the state government, the federal government or the state government, or just a number of weeklies, saying here's how to better produce a crop, here's how to introduce a new crop. As I tried to show, that sounds good. And for us, we can say, why didn't those stupid farmers grow something else? Why didn't they, grow a more profitable crop? Why do they keep growing tobacco? It's getting 4 cents a pound. Some of the best records at UK, which Dr. Clark kept, are Southern Country Store records, in which you can see people's lives all in a notebook. You open an account, you start off with a certain debt, and you have to, share a crop. And each year you can watch this same individual grow deeper and deeper in debt till they lose virtually everything. And they had no other choice. They would have loved, I think, in a lot of points, to grow something else. But the fact was they were trapped.
Well, and most of these people weren't even landowners.
Yeah,
They were,
they did not have the power to think, I think I'll grow something else on this part of it.
it was double tax.
You've introduced a whole new division. You want to join the co-op because you're a tenant farmer, but you're my tenant. And I have no use for this co-op. You're going to grow it next week or else you're off my land. But if you do that, then when you go to church next Sunday, nobody's going to speak to you. So it's a lose-lose situation anywhere you go, which is part of, I think, the frustration that you can read probably better in Knight Rider than virtually anything. Yeah, Richard.
Is there any evidence that the organization of resistance in western Kentucky was in part influenced by movements which were occurring in the Midwest, the Grange movement, the general populism in the country at the time, particularly during the 1890s,
right.
Instead of raising, where the battle cry became, let's raise less corn and more oil. Was that part of the impetus that generated this resistance in western Kentucky?
Well, I first came across this in a book by James O'Neill, written in 1939. And it starts off on page 1 with 5,000 tobacco growers meeting in Guthrie. And I have been working at Duke with a populist historian who'd written a lot on populism, who I began to understand that if you start off with 5,000 growers, you've missed the story. It starts off with 1 or 2, then they organize 10, then you get 50, then they call together 100. Next thing, step 55 is 5,000 growers meeting on a Saturday. So if I could put together how they got to that point, I might understand it. Well, the same folks who had been there in the 1890s organizing for the Populists were back again organizing for the PPA. The same counties that voted the highest for the populist candidates in the 1890s were the ones who organized the most the next decade in the PPA. So this was really the aftermath of populism. This was the residue. That they were kind of destroyed, but here in Kentucky, there was one last, they rose again, if you want to call it that, but they failed again. But we look down our nose at groups and think, well, they failed, therefore they didn't know any better. Well, as a historian or anybody else, think, okay, here's what you should have done. I can't think of anything. Like I said, they were up against the world, both at the social level, politically, economically, and up against one of the most powerful monopolies in American history. which had to be broken up on the same day that Standard Oil was broken up. James B. Duke's tobacco monopoly was broken up as well. It doesn't get the same kind of attention, but James B. Duke was the third richest man in the country by 1900. And built that university that produced Christian Leitner.
Doris.
Much to
And Doris.
Doris, that
Giving and all, giving and doing this and that. So.
exactly.
How does it spin off into the post-Great Depression in the 30s? Where once again we get this conflict arising?
Well, that's a good question. How does it spin off? Well, there was another movement in the 1920s. We think of the Roaring Twenties as a time of unparalleled economic growth. Well, in the agricultural areas, the 1920s was the beginning of the Depression. Prices are going below the floor again in the 1920s. And in the Burley areas, I remember in Lexington, in 1918, during the war, tobacco was bringing 18, 20 cents per pound. The next year, when the war was over, it was bringing 2 and 3 cents per pound. And they had to get the police to close up the warehouses to stop people from bringing guns and knives because they were so angry about it. They tried another cooperative experiment in the 1920s in Kentucky along the same lines. Let's pull it together. Hopefully, this is a really bad comparison, but it'll be kind of like the way a Walmart works. If we pull all of our crops together, buy them in bulk, we can get them cheaper, and we can sell them for a better price. And they were given a $1 million loan, for example, by Robert W. Bingham, who's about ready to enter a bigger fray of his own. But that co-op failed again by 1927. So you can see that on the verge of the New Deal, tobacco has gone through periods of organizing failure, so that when the AAA comes around, some very powerful tobacco senators from tobacco states can get tobacco put into the beginning AAA as a basic commodity, which begins, I guess, the road toward price supports.
Thank you very much.
Well, thanks for having me. It's nice to be somewhere. I took my son to Mammoth Cave Monday, and we went down the cave, and somebody said, well, okay, I know you're having fun talking about geology, but we're going to talk about history for a couple of seconds. I know nobody likes history, but I got to say it for a couple of seconds. And she went through a little talk, so it's nice to talk to people where I don't have to apologize for liking history.
Well, thank you all for coming out, and for those of you that have an interest in Frankfort and Franklin County history that don't yet have this book, Capital on the Kentucky, it's available at Poor Richard's Bookstore. Our next meeting is going to be in August, and Richard Taylor is going to talk about the history of Leestown. So I thank you all for coming out tonight. Again, thank the Farmers Bank for letting us use their community room, and hope to see you in August.